Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're located. This is Cindy from CPSE, and I'd like to welcome you to today's sponsored webinar, Reaping the Benefits of Accreditation with Dark Horse Emergency. It's a pleasure to introduce Daniel Haight, President of Dark Horse Analytics. Dark Horse provides software and consulting services to help emergency organizations transition to an evidence-based culture. Dan is an award-winning lecturer at the University of Alberta and the former analytics advisor to the Edmonton Oilers NHL hockey team. If you have any questions during this webinar, please type them into the chat window in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording so you can share it with others. Please, at the end of the webinar, if you have any questions, contact Dark Horse directly. For anything you need, you can contact Dan. I'm sure his email is right there in front of you. And please visit their booth at the 2022 Excellence Conference, March 22nd through 25th at the Caribe Royale Convention Center in Orlando, Florida. Thanks for attending, and now Dan will begin the webinar.
Thank you, Cindy, and welcome everyone. So as Cindy said, I'd like to answer questions as they come up, so I'll be stopping periodically and checking the chat. But my goal at the end of this today is that you'd have a better understanding of both how to do accreditation well and how to get the most out of accreditation, with particular emphasis on some of the more difficult and data-intensive parts of accreditation. Of course, you know, we are a software company, and the software we've built is to help you in this journey, and so you'll certainly get a chance to see how the software we use can help you do so. But it's certainly not just an hour-long demo. We've talked to a number of organizations and worked with a number that have gone through accreditation, and we'll be sharing some of their stories and some of their key findings, as well as some of our own. So just a quick bit of background about Dark Horse. We started out as a research lab at the University of Alberta, and I spent 10 years doing research on public safety analytics and modeling, everything from drive time forecasting to station location optimization to redeployment optimization and so forth. And so the company we founded, Dark Horse, is based on that, you know, a decade plus of research, a dozen peer-reviewed publications, 2 doctoral theses, et cetera, but really all that math and all that knowledge is kind of useless if you can't clearly present it and clearly access it. And so that's one of the themes that you'll see throughout this presentation is getting the right answer is half the battle, convincing people it's the right answer is the other half. And visualization is one of the keys to doing that. And a lot of what I'm talking about is how do you visualize the data in such a way that it becomes actionable. So with that out of the way, let me talk about why accreditation. And so from the CPSE site, they describe what the typical accredited agency is perceived as. They're community-focused, data-driven, outcome-focused, strategic-minded, well-organized, properly equipped, and properly staffed and trained. And I imagine all of you would be quite excited if they described your organizations as all of the above. And the reason why they are perceived as such is because they basically found the holy grail of the organization, and that is the continuous improvement loop. We kind of have our own spin on that. We call it maiming it. We want to maim it, not kill it. We measure, then we assess, then we do the intervention, or and then we measure again. And if you can't measure and show measurable change or results, how do you know you're winning, right? And so by having that kind of continuous improvement loop where you're measuring things, you're then making assessments of how to improve those things, you're making changes, and then you're measuring again to see if you actually improved it and making adjustments. Keeping that loop going in your organization is really powerful. And that's really at the high level what accreditation is trying to build. Now, if you talk to people, you'll come across some of the pitfalls of accreditation, what can go wrong. And so one of one of the themes that came up when we were talking to a number of our clients was this idea of parallel systems. And you hire an accreditation manager, and they start following the accreditation process, and it's a significant investment of time and resources to make it work. And you end up with this accreditation strategic plan that you've had peer reviewed and checked off that box. But you also have your business plan or your 5-year plan or your strat plan completely separate that you built at a different point in time. And so you have these two parallel systems. You have a set of accreditation metrics where they're saying you should track the following things. And so you create this report that tracks all of those things, but it's separate from and different from your operational metrics. Maybe there's some overlap, but you kind of, here's the metrics we use to measure our business, and here's the metrics we use to keep accreditation people happy. And I'd suggest that that's a failure if that's the case. Worse yet is you end up with kind of parallel teams. We have the accreditation team, and they understand best practices, and they understand accreditation metrics and strategic planning and so forth, but they're separate from our operational team, and never the two shall meet. And so that is, although it's not a common failure, I think there's a temptation to keep accreditation separate from your business, and that's never the intent. The process is that you should have a strategic plan, and here's a template, but it doesn't have to be exactly that. And the same thing with the metrics, the same thing with the team. Another problem that you're going to run into, and whether or not you get accredited, you're going to have to deal with untrusted and untrustworthy data. And that can be things like outliers. Hey, we have turnout times that take 6 hours. We have gaps where we have allegedly no calls. We have miscategorized data. We have data that we just can't get out of the staffing software. We can't get the data out of the scheduling software. And then you're going to have systematic errors in your data. We ran into one service where the old guard, they're used to using the radios, and so they would call in their en route on the radio, and it takes about 10 seconds or 15 seconds for the dispatcher to then type in the timestamp for when they called in en route. So it looked like they had overly long turnout times, but they didn't. They were just using the radio, and the young guys were using the MDT to mark their en route. So that's a systemic error. It looks like platoon D is way slower on their turnout times, but they make up for it in their travel times, when in reality, it's just a bias in the system. And so what I can say about untrusted and untrustworthy data is the only clean data you have is data where errors would send you to prison. So your data is a mess, and everyone just needs to accept that fact, but that's not an insurmountable hurdle to using that data. And a skilled analyst knows how to deal with outliers. They're either going to take medians or percentiles as opposed to averages and means. They're going to be able to interpolate data where you have gaps, or automatically recategorize it, or do their analysis in such a way that it's not susceptible to bias. And so don't take a step back and say, oh, our data's a mess, we can't do any of this. You just have to approach it appropriately. I mean, there's nothing worse than getting in front of your stakeholders or your council and saying, hey, we had 2,000 fire calls last year and 3,000 the year before. Look how our prevention is improving things. And then the councilor raises their hand and says, last time when you presented a year ago, you said you had 2,500, and now you're saying you had 3,000 2 years ago. What's going on? And so you don't want to have those data errors destroying your credibility. But there are ways around that, and skilled analysts and good software will deal with it appropriately. So the big picture on accreditation is there are these 11 categories of effort that you're going to have to develop metrics for, and develop a plan for, and adopt standard operating procedures, and it's customized to your service. But these are kind of the 11 domains that you're going to deal with. And there are two in particular that are very data intensive. One is your community risk reduction program, and the other one is your standard of cover, which is kind of buried in a couple of these. And so looking at those two in detail, just to simplify, your community risk reduction or community risk assessment, that deals with your demand for service. How much are you needed? And then your standard of cover is really your capacity to respond to that demand for service. So really, you're just looking at supply and demand. That's what the bulk of the data analysis and collection and cleaning is about, the details around demand for your service and your capacity to appropriately respond and to deal with the gaps where you're unable to respond. And so I want to drill down into the community risk reduction first, and then we'll talk about standard of cover. Again, if you have any questions on the way through, just type it into the chat, and I'll try to get to you as we go. So the first thing you want to do in risk assessment and risk reduction is you want to create or conduct a risk profile study. And there are, depending on which approach you take, there are 9 or 10 or 11 different risk profiles. And I think of these as different lenses with which to look at your community and to cast a wide net to understand the breadth of risk that you're facing. The first step that you're going through is you're building these risk profiles for your community. So different views, different lenses, but the whole point is identification. You're just trying to make sure you're not missing anything. So one thing you'll notice when you look at these different risk profiles is most of them can be tied back to location, can be tied back to place. You have hazards that are, spatial. You have demography that is distributed spatially. You have geography, you have lakes, you have rivers, you have bridges, intersections. You have building stock, which is spatial. You have critical infrastructure, which is again spatial. You have past loss data, and you have economic profiles, and all of these things can have coordinates on a map. And because they can have coordinates on a map, that makes them much more actionable. Tornadoes or earthquakes or tornadoes are not primarily spatial. You don't know exactly where they're going to land, but you do know which buildings are most vulnerable to tornadoes. You do know which buildings are most vulnerable to earthquakes, right? That's what your critical infrastructure and your hazards try to deal with. And so given that your risk profiles create spatial data, that's one of the key and important insights that you're going to take from going through this profiling process. So once I've done the profiling and I've identified a whole bunch of risks, I've looked at my historical data, my past loss data, and I found out that, man, we have this roundabout that generates a whole bunch of calls. And we're always responding to the roundabout, this new roundabout. Everyone's doing fender benders. And then, your hazards have identified this nuclear power plant. Like if that ever has a meltdown, oh Lord help us. That's very risky. So of these two, which has a higher risk? I want you to think about that. Which has a higher risk? And the way you would prioritize and decide which has a higher risk is you would do this frequency consequence characterization. So you're going to look at each of those spatially identified risks in your community, and you're going to say, how likely is this to happen? What is the probability of an event associated with that facility or that location? And what is the consequence, or what is the potential impact of that particular risk happening? And those are two very different things. And in our minds, we think of them both as risk, right? And often we confuse those two, but I'm going to suggest that separating frequency and consequences is one of the fundamental benefits of doing a robust risk characterization. And confusing those two is one of the common errors in doing a risk analysis. And I can say we worked with one service where they were talking about how they got their crews out to do a risk assessment in every community. And what they found is that every single community in the city was high risk. And so if you find out that every single community is high risk, or every single neighborhood, then basically you can't do anything about it. And so one of the ways to make it more actionable is to separate out the frequency and the consequence. And you've probably all seen this overlay where basically if it's high frequency and low consequence, we call it a medium, or maybe we call it a high risk. And if it's a high consequence, low probability, again, we call it a medium risk. And if it's in the top right corner, kind of high consequence, high frequency, we would call it a severe risk or a special risk, right? So if we're just using the word risk, we're going to say these two things are equivalent, but the way you deal with them is completely different, obviously, right? So one of the key lessons we want to say is risk is not the same thing as frequency or probability, which is not the same thing as consequence. And when you confuse those, frequency and consequence, describing risk, it basically clouds things, and it allows or forces you, it makes it more difficult to do anything actionable about your risk. All right. So how do you estimate frequency? Well, for the most part, it should be quantitative. You don't need your prevention manager or your crews or your platoon chiefs to go out and estimate the frequency of fires in their neighborhoods if you have a CAD system. If you have a CAD system, you already know the frequency of your existing building stock, your existing infrastructure, your existing intersections and roads. You already know spatially and temporally how many calls for service, and maybe even the amount of damage or the consequence level that happens at that. We have our diagnostic software, which ties into your CAD or your RMS and can pull this data and make it accessible. But I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have access to this data. So don't go through it and waste time trying to estimate the frequency of calls. The only time you need to do an estimate is if you have a new building stock. Hey, we have this new retirement center. It hasn't generated a call yet because it hasn't opened. But next year, it's likely going to generate a whole bunch of calls. And so that's the only time you're really using that qualitative or judgment-based estimation of risk frequency. The consequence estimation, though, needs to be done with some degree of judgment. It's basically a combination of qualitative and quantitative. And so this is actually the instrument that Toronto uses to categorize their risks. And so they kind of have 3 or 4 dimensions that they're looking at, and they have 4 levels or five levels of risk that they associate with it. So for life safety, it's how many fatalities or injuries can I expect if there's an incident? How much property damage can I expect if there's an incident? And so think about this: I have a multi-family wood structure, and I have perhaps the chance of a fire, but it's a sprinklered building, and it's kind of well planned, and it's got firewalls between the different units. And so at most, I would expect only one of the units to burn, as opposed to, hey, I have this building that's under construction and it's going to take a long time. And so, and it's a wood structure, and it's probably much more consequent. It's likely that the whole thing goes up, and possibly even part of the neighborhood goes up if it burns. And so the significance associated with the consequence is much higher in the latter case than in the former case. And so you're looking at the property damage of the incident, given the amount of mitigation that's in place, sprinklers and firewalls and so forth. And then you're looking at economic and environmental. What is if this bridge goes out, what's that going to cost the city? If the power system goes down, what's that going to cost our community? all those people out of work, no longer shopping, all those people unable to do their job and make money for the economy, or the environmental impact, that hazardous material leaking into our watershed. What is the cost of that? All right. So this is much more qualitative, and you can categorize major structures, and then you can kind of look at, okay, this entire neighborhood of single family dwellings, they all have almost identical consequence estimates. It's very unlikely to spread to the whole neighborhood. It's going to be limited to the structure of origin. And so I can kind of bulk categorize whole groups of houses together doing this. All right. So that's your consequence estimation, and different approaches to that. And some might have 4 or 5 or even more dimensions. But the idea is you want to separate consequence from frequency. And consequence is much more qualitative. And then once you're done that, you can place them on this kind of risk visualization. And then you can see that my new roundabout, yeah, high frequency, low consequence, the propane factory, high consequence, low probability. And then I have that meth lab in the high rise, the wooden high rise, and that's severe risk, high consequence, high probability of an event. All right. So once you visualize it, now it feels much more actionable. And we know that once it's in that kind of view and it's obvious to everyone, then I can start looking at the different treatment options. That big industrial site, I can transfer the risk and say, hey, you guys need to build your own fire response capability in-house. Maybe I can just accept the fact that, we've got earthquake risk and we can't rebuild all these high rises yet. But mainly you're going to be thinking about mitigation. And you've probably all heard of the 5 E's of risk reduction and or mitigation. And those 5 E's are all about reducing frequency and reducing consequence. You can do it through education, and you should do it through education first. You can do it through incentives. Hey, working with the insurance companies to reduce the premiums on those that have high compliance to codes and such. Doing enforcement, closing down those facilities that have continual violations. And then later on, engineering, making sure that the building codes, are appropriate. I know one service was able to convince their community that any building over 4 stories high needed to dedicate a room to fire equipment on every 5 floors. So you have a room with hoses and suppression gear available, so you don't have to haul it up 20 stories of stairway before you can actually start putting water on a fire. So there's engineering work they can do. And then, lastly, and I say lastly because it's the most expensive, is emergency response. So before you say we have to open a new station right next to the ammunition dump, you should talk to the ammunition dump people and say, look, we need to put some concrete baffles between your different piles of ammunition so that the whole thing doesn't go up, etc. I'm being a bit facetious here. All right, so we're going to reduce the risk through the 5 E's, and then you get this new picture where you show that, yes, I've reduced the frequency on the roundabout by educating people of how to signal and how to exit a roundabout. We have a campaign of TV ads of how to use the roundabout, and we make sure that all drivers training and drivers certification has to go through the roundabout before they get their license. You've gone to the meth lab and you've told them how to do chemistry more safely. No, I'm joking. You've worked with the police to shut down the meth lab. You've worked with the propane factory to put on-site suppression and baffles in place. And you can show over time that you're mitigating this risk and you're moving those bubbles into the medium risk or into the low risk, whatever the case may be. All right, so that's kind of your community risk reduction in a nutshell. But then the big question is, how do we make this actionable? How do we make this sustainable so that we continue to identify new risks as they come up? We continue to reprioritize those risks, hey, you know what, we keep inspecting this place and they keep failing the inspection, maybe they're higher risk than we think. And then you continue to mitigate. All right, we've shut that building down. They keep failing at dealing with their meth labs. And that process, again, is a continuous improvement loop within your risk and prevention organization. But I want to propose that the best way to do this is to engage your frontline staff. The people best positioned to understand and deal with risk in your community are your frontline staff. And having them take ownership of the risk within their zone, within their fire catchment area, I think is a best practice. And what we're seeing is a movement towards that. So I have my prevention officer, 2 or 3 guys or 5 guys and gals that are going out in the community. There's no way that they can inspect and understand and remember the different and changing risks in your community, as well as your frontline staff who are in those communities all the time. And so having them engage and going around and doing inspections, and I'm not saying doing enforcement, because we all know firefighters don't like to get out there and give tickets and be hated by the public. But have them go and do the inspection and say, hey, by the way, we can't give tickets, but if this is still a mess 2 months from now, when the actual enforcement comes around, you're going to be paying the man. So you can have them be the good guys if you want, and do those inspections, but not just the commercial buildings. Have them do the smoke alarm tests and the replacing the batteries and the quick kind of 2 minutes of education as they go into the houses and talk people through, hey, maybe you shouldn't be piling up all that combustible stuff right by your fireplace, as they're looking around the room, replacing the batteries in the smoke alarm. And what you'll find is that that's enormously effective in reducing both structure fires and even more so the fatalities due to fire. Research out of the UK and Atlanta and Surrey, British Columbia, have found about a 50% reduction in fatalities in services that do this proactive community risk reduction. It's one of the single most effective things you can do to address risk and improve the safety in your community. And the ones that do it with their frontline staff are the ones that actually have the resources to do it. And it's not easy, and I know there are hurdles to this. And there is a cultural problem in fire services. Historically, we've been kind of responders. We're going to sit in the station until the phone rings, right? And culturally, we have to transition out of that. And I know some services have gone so far as to hire industrial psychologists to profile their staff. And they know which staff kind of have the right attitude to respond, to be more proactive as opposed to response oriented. And then not firing the ones that don't match that profile, but actually preferentially hiring new people as they grow and as they replace their staff who have that different mindset. And over time, they've completely changed the culture to have a much more community, out in the community, proactive approach as opposed to just being response oriented. I mean, you're always going to have to do the responding, but you can be far more effective if the crews are out there educating the public, doing the home safety checks, and so forth. The other thing that happens is you can do your pre-plans because you're out there in the community looking at the buildings and seeing how they're changing over time and keeping those pre-plans up to date so that you're going to be more effective when you do indeed have to do a response. And all that beautiful data can be put into pictures that look like this. In my Station 23 catchment area, here's my big risks, and here's what I'm doing to deal with shady acres and reduce the frequency. We're convincing them to put railings on the beds so people don't fall out so often. And here's what we're doing within the ammunition dump and so forth, and continually owning the risk in that community. All right, and I can tell you that it has been done, and it's difficult. And if you're using data to support the decision making, you'll prioritize the right things. And I know one fire chief who their hypothesis was that they needed to get out into the immigrant communities and to help teach them about risk. And a couple years into it, when they weren't noticing a lot of difference in the number of fires that were happening, they took a deeper dive in their data and they discovered that actually those immigrant communities had very low risk, low frequency, low consequence. It was actually the 18 to 30-year-old males and communities that had a high proportion of them that were generating all the risk, and they weren't immigrants. They were young men learning how to cook and having backyard barbecues while they were drunk, right? And so make sure you focus your efforts where the data leads, not where you think the problems are. It might be different than you think. And if you're doing this and you're visually reporting this, by nature, you're going to be doing that right. All right, so that's kind of the halfway point. That's the community risk reduction. And so I would say the big thing I'm suggesting here is to visualize that risk at a station catchment area and to continue to update it using your frontline staff. I think that is the way to do risk reduction and risk mitigation and risk communication well. I'm going to talk about standard of cover now. And if you go to the CPSE site, they'll talk about standard of cover being the decisions made around the placement of resources in order to address the demand for service and to meet a commitment to a performance level. And I kind of highlighted that commitment to performance and the placement of resources. And what you're trying to do with your standard of cover is basically what your internet service provider does when they say, I'm going to promise to make sure that your internet is on 99% of the time, right? That's what your fractile performance commitments are, is you're saying in much more detail, you know, I'm going to get to 90% or 80% or 83% of calls in 9 minutes. And then there's this kind of if component to your standards of cover, the policy recommendations. If you invest in my service to provide sufficient resources to do so, and here's the resources I need in order to hit that target. So let's look in a little more detail about what is included in a standard of cover. So there's kind of three components. There's the distribution of your resources, which really is a synonym for station location or your proximity to your calls. And proximity is important, like the real estate guys say, location, location, location. Location is everything. If you have well-located stations, you're halfway there, all right? And then there's the concentration, which is how many vehicles do I have in those stations, my depth of coverage. Do I have the right units in those locations? Do I have my high-rise vehicles near the high-rises? Do I have my hazmat near where all my hazmat calls are occurring? And do I have enough of them that they're going to be available when the calls come in? And then finally, the reliability is really just your metrics. How well am I doing? What is my response performance? What are the response issues? What things cause me to struggle in offering response performance that I would like to hit? And once you know once you understand reliability, and you, in particular, understand the why of reliability, then you can make good policy recommendations. And one of the things you'll discover is that there are lots of levers that will move the stone, right? There are lots of ways to skin the cat, lots of things you can do, investments and interventions you can make to improve your response performance, but some are way more expensive than others. You can solve a turnout problem by doubling the number of stations, so everyone's closer, right? Or you can solve it by improving egress, or you can solve it by creating some healthy competition amongst your platoons, right? So looking at this from what is the primary driver of my response issues, that's what we say is the best practice. And then you're going to give policy recommendations that make sense. So let's look a little bit at distribution. Here's a screenshot from our Dark Horse deployment tool. So you look at this and you can see here's the city. Each of these hexes has a color to it that represents the number of calls that that hex generates. So you're going to look at this, and some of you will say, I don't think these stations are well located, and you're probably right. You know, if I look at the station 3 downtown, it's kind of in an area where there's not a lot of calls. And I can see the color of those hexes is my ability to respond. You know, green means I can get there 90% of the time. Orange means I can get there 60% of the time. Red means I can't get there even half the time, right? So being closer to those calls allows me to improve my response performance. And there's very little you can do about it. I mean, you can add some traffic preemption to improve that halo of coverage. There's a few other things you can do around that on setup times and such. But in general, you need to be close to where the calls are coming from. And so you can use our tools, and you look at this one, it's pretty easy to solve. And in fact, let's try and solve it. So let's go to College Town. This is the Dark Horse deployment app. So here's how I would improve my distribution. If I had the ability to move station 3, I could just move it like this. And it would tell me the change in first due performance. That got me 0.5% improvement. That improved my drive times by 13 seconds citywide. I get to an additional 65 calls that I couldn't get to before. You know, maybe I can do a little better. Maybe I got to go a little further north. Nope. You know, and I could play around with this, clicking and clacking to see if I could get better performance. And no, that 0.5 is about as good as I could get. Oh, 0.9 if I don't go quite so close to station 2. And so we used to offer this as a game in conferences, and we would give out prizes, and we had a leaderboard of, you know, hey, you're the new fire chief and you've got $5 million to add a new station. Where do you add it? And what we found out was that it was so much fun, and these guys that wanted to be top of the leaderboard, they would skip the sessions to just sit here playing around and clicking around and trying to optimize their station locations, because it's so, you know, it's almost fun to try to figure it out. And, you know, look at this. By adding one new station and, you know, making a couple little moves, I've improved response performance by 6%. And I can get to an extra 800 and some calls that I wouldn't have got to otherwise. So we would say use a tool like this to do station planning. And it, you know, in a small city like College Town, it's pretty easy. But if you get to a place like Toronto, you know, where's the best place to add a station? In fact, what's the single best move I could make in Toronto? It's not as obvious. I mean, yeah, there's something going on here kind of in the Don Valley area where I have a lot of red. There's something else going down here on the beaches near the waterfront where I don't have good coverage, I don't have good distribution. But the other thing we offer as a company is optimization, and fairly complex optimizations. For a city like Toronto, we can say, you know, these 5 stations have deferred maintenance costs that are more than the value of rebuilding. And so we can move them, we can put them somewhere else. And, you know, we have budget for 1 net new station. And these 25 stations, we will not move no matter what. So, or maybe the rest of the stations, we're not going to move, we're stuck with them. So what should we do? And we can run that optimization, and we can say, given that you can move any of these 5, given that you can add 1, and given that you can't move the rest, here's the best possible solution for you. And then they can look at it in the app and they can say, okay, you know, thank you very much, Dark Horse. That looks great, but I know if I move this College Town station, let's say I'm going to turn on ward boundaries. You know, if I move this, oh no, I added a new one. If I move this new station somewhere just outside of this ward, then I'm going to be way better off. But if I'm not in Ward 4, but if I move it into Ward 6, I know I can sell it. So I give up a little bit of my performance, a little bit of my, you know, ability to serve, but I know I can actually get a station done because it's in this other ward. That's a better solution. And so this is kind of one of the fundamental philosophies we have as a company, is that analytics and optimal solutions can never be a replacement for your judgment as an analyst or as a manager in your company or in your organization. That analytics should support your decision making, and there should be an interplay between the two, but it does not replace. And so you're going to bring more things to the table, like politically, how can I sell this? Or the land value, I can never sell at that location. And you're going to use a tool like this to then make the tweaks and see the trade-offs, and then be able to present to your stakeholders something that's much more likely to be accepted. Man, if you can show this by words and say, look, Councillor Jones, it's going to improve performance in your area by almost 10% by adding this new station. And that's why we want to do it. All right. You'll see another thing. One of the other things we recommend is, and this is from the Greater Salt Lake Unified Fire Service. They deal with all these colored communities, but they don't deal with these black and white communities. But they have mutual aid agreements between them. And so if you're doing a distribution study and you're not taking into account the fact that Murray has this station fairly close to the edge of my service area in Holiday, and they can respond into that area here. So maybe I don't need my Mill Creek station right on the edge, because Station 43 and Station 81 can cover off some of this if we create a mutual aid agreement. So maybe I can move that Mill Creek station further into the interior. So taking into account those mutual aid agreements and doing your planning with those in mind is another best practice. All right. And lastly, take into account that this is not a one-time thing, that your station planning, your distribution study needs to be done over time. So you need to incorporate your city's growth, both spatially and vertically, and your growth in calls that you're going to expect. And so this is a chart we did for a fast-growing community. They had 2 stations to begin with. They're adding a 3rd and a 4th and eventually a 5th over a 20-year time horizon because they're growing. I think they're going to double in size over a 10-year period or 15-year period. And so we could show that if they did nothing, this first line would just continue to decline, and in a period of 7 years, it'd go from 87% down to 75% in the response performance. But they could add a new station in 2017 and would boost it up. And then that would buy them some time. They'd buy them another 5 years. And then in 2021, they need to add another station to then get them through to where they wanted to go. So having that temporal lens and station rollout. And again, we know that forecasts are not accurate. And they actually didn't build it in 2017. They actually grew a little slower because the economy slowed down, and they were able to defer that station a bit because they kept updating that forecast. But you're keeping your stakeholders apprised that, you know what, down the pipeline, we're going to need a new station. In fact, we even know where we want it. And so we can earmark that land to be appropriate for it. All right, so doing your distribution studies well, here's some of the key findings that we've come up with. Number 1, drive times, the sensitivity of any modeling you do to drive times is really high. If you get your drive times wrong, your station plan is going to be out to lunch. And so accurate drive times is critical, and you can't just use the Google Maps drive times. We go so far as to calculate a cruising speed and acceleration rate for every neighborhood in your city and in your community, and thus have very accurate drive times from every hex to every hex in your community, so that when you're locating a new station, you know how wide of an area it can cover. And we've seen a lot of services that are built around poor drive time assumptions, and you actually end up with a station density which is too low. And so have accurate drive times, do that well. Don't ignore the mutual aid, I already talked about that. You're using first due performance when you're building your station plans. There will be a secondary kind of input to that, which is your ERF, but ERF is more about your concentration. First due is about how quickly can I get there to either assess the scene or defibrillate the patient or rescue the person trapped in the house. or begin planning the rescue. Obviously plan for the long term, do that 20 or 30-year forecast of calls and forecast of road networks and forecast of service area. Smaller stations are better, mixed use, not multi-service. I have a whole webinar on station planning well, so I want to kind of skip over this a little bit because of time, but the station planning and station planning well, we've been doing this for 20 years and we have a lot of thoughts about it, and we have an actual station guide on our website, station planning guide that you can download. So let's talk about concentration, because station planning is hard, concentration planning is even harder. And so let's go back to our little college town. So this is our oops. Let's reload the baseline current system. Reset. Oh, now, of course, the internet is giving me trouble. We'll reload it. It's the beauty of these online software. They will allow a quick reboot, or so I thought. Actually, I'm gonna take a look at the future state. So when I'm trying to do my concentration study, what I need to look at is the ERF associated with my service. So look at this. College Town has a really poor ERF performance. Less than 30% of the time can I even get a low risk 12 firefighter response out to a structure fire. And I have just a little bit of orange around my downtown area. So why is that? Well, that's because I don't have enough firefighters in the area. In Station 2, I have 7 firefighters. In Station 3, I have 6 firefighters. So yeah, I've got 13 who can respond to this area here. So that's why I'm getting at least some ERF performance, but I can improve it by adding another unit. Let's add another engine. And actually, that didn't improve it much, and that's because I added a volunteer engine, and it takes them almost 10 minutes to get there. So I'm going to turn that into a career, and now I can see, wow, just adding that one unit gave me 15% performance improvement. In fact, I can get to 2,600 structure fire incidents. This is a town full of arsonists, obviously. I can get to those calls in my target ERF response performance target. And so, in fact, I could add another unit to that downtown area. Let's make sure it's not volunteer, but career. And sure enough, I've improved my performance by 25% just by doing that. In fact, let's go out here to this east station, Station 4, and let's just turn that volunteer crew, and instead of a composite station, let's make it a full career station. Wow, now I'm at 27% performance for my ERF. And again, I can move those vehicles around. In fact, I could move people around. I could turn them into 5-man trucks or 6-man trucks. And I can see right away that that's improved my drive times by 30 seconds, that it's improved the number of over-goal incidents I can get to in my target time by almost 5,000. So I am demonstrating my concentration. And again, we can optimize this. You can imagine this is pretty easy to do in College Town, but if you're Toronto or if you are, UFSA, it's much more difficult. Where should I put my hazmat units? Where should I put my my heavy rescue or my high-rise units? And so then I need to look at, let's look at my MVA calls, or let's look at my EMS calls to figure out where I put my ambulances in the service areas. All right, so that's how we can do concentration using the tools that Dark Horse has developed. And one of the other things you should do is you can look at low risk, medium risk, high risk locations, and you can figure out your ability to serve each of those with your existing service deployment and your existing units. And then you can find the gaps in like this community of Nanaimo. They're building a new industrial center, and they can get there 0% of the time with suppression units. So maybe they need to add either a new station out there or new units into Station 4 to provide that suppression and coverage as the risk increases in their community. All right. So doing concentration well, again, drive times are important. Mutual aid is important. You're thinking ERF, you're not thinking first due. Consider cross-staffing, right? Especially if you're like a combined fire and EMS system and you have cross-trained crews. Cross-staffing, it's more expensive to pay for people than it is for vehicles. And then other thing to consider is risk reduction. This going back to that CRR. I know of Tim Beckett in Mississauga. When they did their concentration study, they looked and they said, you know, in order to address the risk in our community, we're going to need to double the number of stations we have and double the number of firefighters. And there's no way that we can meet the requirements of the ERF and high risk requirements in our community with the budget that council is even willing to even consider. And so instead, they invested heavily in prevention and mitigation, and they hired far more into that area. Again, not doubling their organization, but through mitigation and education and those 5 E's, they're able to move a number of high risk and severe risk structures and infrastructure into medium risk. And so no longer did they need to provide 39 firefighter response, but they could reduce down to a medium risk response, a 29 or whatever it was. And so they were able to skin the cat through prevention as opposed to just throwing resources at the problem. And so risk reduction is one of the tools in your tool belt that also helps with your concentration and your standard of cover. All right. The third part of this is reliability. And I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to go through this a little quicker. But I mean, reliability is just, again, your metrics and your measurements around your response performance. And you need to be able to do, your incident counts, your response performance, your travel times, your turnout times. We do a thing called over goals, which is which calls you didn't get to. And we find this is a very effective way to kind of do root cause and diagnose in your organization. Which calls didn't I get to? Where and when am I not getting to them? And then, even more importantly, so here's the where, showing it on your maps, but doing why. So this is what time of day, when are we performing well? You can see at night, I'm struggling to respond to my medical calls at night. Why is that? Am I understaffed? Are they, are my crews having trouble egressing from the stations because the beds are too comfortable, etc. But the why question is an important one. If we were to look at this service, they have a spike at 9 a.m. and we've categorized the reason behind that as busy. So this is probably the most important thing that we do in reliability and in reporting and metrics, is we have this logic model that parses through all your overgo calls and tells you why you're having trouble responding. And is it because it's just too far away, or is it because your turnout time was way over goal? Or is it because you're just too busy, or you're tied up at the hospital, your ambulance is spending too long in the hospital and thus couldn't respond? And so when I see something like this and I see a spike at 9 a.m. with busy, to me that suggests that there's something going on shift change. That people are saying I'm still on a call for these last half an hour, even though I'm not still on a call, because I don't want to get stuck on a call at end of shift. Or it takes me too long to get back to my single start station, or something such that. So going through even manually and parsing your calls to why didn't I get to that fire call on time and then grouping that together will tell you where you should invest. Do I need more stations? Do I need more units? Do I need to crack the whip on turnout times, etc.? All right. So doing reliability well, don't forget your data, making sure it's trustworthy. I'll say very rare is the fire service that actually tracks ERF with any level of accuracy. And so doing the work to be able to track it and to be able to report it. We're able to report that right out of the box in our diagnostics. Tracking the right metrics. Many organizations track too many things. You know, I've got this wall of dashboards and it looks really cool in the ops center, or it looks really cool on my laptop, but I have no idea what it means. You know, 3 or 4 metrics for an individual that they're responsible for, that's more than enough. Make sure the right people are seeing the right metrics, right? If you want your crews to improve their turnout times, make sure they can see them. You know, put them on a big screen in the hall, right? You also need processes that reinforce this behavior. If you don't have a standing agenda item that says, "Hey, let's review our response performance in your monthly management meeting," you're not going to actually look at your response performance ever, because you don't have any trigger or habit of doing so. And data literacy and data culture is probably the elephant in the room. I mean, if you ask 100 people if they're data literate, 80 of them will say yes, and half of them will be lying, right? Data literacy is very difficult to build, and it takes time, and it takes concerted effort. It's like learning a new language. If you wanted your entire department to become bilingual, you wouldn't just buy some bilingual software and expect them to be bilingual. The same is true of data literacy. In fact, I have a whole webinar on building a data culture in your fire service that you can check out. Lastly, policy recommendations. I'll say one thing here: make it visual and use scenario planning. So this is from one of the services we worked with. We said, we've looked at a whole bunch of things, but what's going to improve the most? You got to clean your own house first. You got to take care of your setup times, your call handling, your dispatching, your turnout times. If you can cut, 15 seconds off of those, that's 2.5% improvement. That's as much of an improvement as adding a station. Just cutting 15 seconds off your setup times. And after we do that, then we can ask for more crews and more stations. And asking for another 4 firefighters, that adds another 3.5%. Now look, I've gone from 72% to 83% by doing those 3 things. And I can visually show that, how much that improves my first due. Now I'm a B+ service instead of a C service, right? And then I can look at the same changes and the same interventions on my ERF. And I can say, look, improving those setup times doesn't do much. It adds about 1% to my ERF. But wow, adding those 4 firefighters in station 1, that's almost a 30% improvement. I go from being kind of 0 on the ERF, or an F on the ERF, to 30, getting to a third of those calls. And then adding that new station even puts me above. So now I'm getting to more than half. And I can communicate this visually to my stakeholders. I can say, this is why we're suggesting to do the following things. Here's the scenario. And maybe you have a low cost or the do nothing scenario. And then you have this kind of, and if we win the lottery scenario. But that's the way you communicate. Communicate visually to your stakeholders. So doing it well, again, put your house in order first. Take care of your operations. Don't try and solve a dispatch time problem by adding firefighters. Don't try and overwhelm your stakeholders with evidence. Minimum necessary evidence. Show them what they need to know in order to make a decision. Just enough to make that decision. Understand their perceptions and address those perceptions. Do some peer benchmarking to kind of come at this from multiple directions. And lastly, allow your stakeholders to interact. UFSA, we have a case study about this. They took that tool that you saw, the deployment tool, and they went on a roadshow to all 11 municipalities that they deal with. And they showed them, here's our station plan and here's how it affects you. And in some cases, they did it live, and the mayor would say, well, we really want to build a hall there. And so they could just click on the map and show them, look, it really makes no difference. We're going to spend a few million and it's not going to actually improve our service to our citizens. And so the mayor's like, you know what, you're right. it needs to be where you said. So interacting, it really helps that engagement. A few final thoughts. If at the end of your accreditation journey, you actually have a continuous improvement loop, that's a legacy you can be proud of, whether or not you actually get accredited. If you can build that into your culture, that's a huge deal. Your culture and your processes are just as important, if not more so, than the technology you adopt, as are the people you hire. Be prepared for the long haul. It's not going to be an easy journey. And, data wrangling is going to be a big deal. You can go to our site. We have a bunch of resources for those who are interested. How to develop a data culture, how to build a defensible strategic plan, how to do station planning well, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't see any questions. I assume that's because I did such a great job on covering this topic. But if you want to reach out, there'll be a link in the email that goes out to connect with me directly, and we can chat about your service and some of the things you're struggling with. I'd be happy to help, and appreciate your time. Our mission is to help you guys make better decisions and to basically raise the level of decision making in public safety. And I hope we've taken a step towards that today. So all the best. And here is a short link, email address if you want to contact me directly. All the best. Take care.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Thanks everybody for joining us today. And an email will be coming shortly with the link. Take care.